Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here to talk about 501c3 bonds. My name is Britt McLean. I'm an operations and policy analyst in the Affordable Rental Housing Division here at OHCS, and I will be facilitating the conversation between y'all and some very smart folks who know a lot about this resource type. So let's go ahead and get started. Our agenda today, pretty straightforward. We're going to go through some housekeeping meeting agreements. We're going to talk about what 501c3 bonds are. Why are we talking about 501c3 bonds? We're going to go through the eligibility for this resource type with ORIC. We will talk about how this resource will function within the ORCA process, and then we will be sure to leave plenty of time for your questions. We ask that you hold your questions until the question portion because more than likely your question will be answered by the presentation. We will ask you to either raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and then I will try to bounce back between the live questions and the questions in the chat. Our objectives today, also pretty straightforward. We want to inform you about this resource. A lot of you probably are very aware of the resource, but just how it will function within OHCS. We want to gather your feedback about how we can make this process run smoother, consult with you about any points of clarification or outstanding questions that you might have, and then share implementation progress, timelines, next steps, that kind of thing. Our process agreements, we really try to use these in all of our public engagements. I won't read through them. They're also fairly straightforward. Again, we ask that you stay muted when you're not speaking because it can be distracting. So if everyone could make sure that they're muted now, that would be great. And then when you ask your question, if you could give us your name and affiliation when you ask your question, that would also be really helpful just to know sort of your POV. Okay, we'll keep going here. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kelso, who will dive into the content of this resource. Go ahead, Kelso, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelso. I'm the Financial Strategy Analyst at OHCS, also on the Affordable Rental Housing Division team. I'm fairly new to the agency, so I'm very grateful that our partners at ORIC are here that will be presenting right after me, diving into some of the federal tax law, and they know way more about 501c3 bonds than I do, so hopefully they can correct me if I misspeak. So I'll just go over a little bit about just generally what are 501c3 bonds. They are tax-exempt bonds for nonprofits that qualify as 501c3 organizations. They do not require volume cap, so they are not resource constrained. However, they are not eligible to receive low-income housing tax credits. The interest paid on tax-exempt debt is exempt from federal and state income tax, and so that means that borrowers pay less interest on these bonds. This allows you to leverage a lot more debt than taxable, and sort of the taxable tax-exempt spread can vary based on market factors. But I was just recently looking at a project where the tax-exempt rates were 100 basis points less than taxable, and it can be even greater than that. Under Oregon law, OHCS has statutory authority to allow funding for projects up to 120% AMI. As you all know, a lot of our resources have lower AMI restrictions, but for 501c3 bonds, those will be able to go up to 120% AMI. There are additional federal tax law requirements for 501c3 bonds that ORIC will go into in the next slides, but just kind of for under Oregon law, our limit at OHCS is 120% AMI. And then I just wanted to point out a few potential uses for 501c3 bonds that we've highlighted here. We think these might be useful for projects that are eligible for LIFT or for PSH funding, for preservation, acquisition, and market to affordable conversion projects, and then for mixed income projects, workforce or middle housing projects, especially given the up to 120% AMI limit. One example of a deal that used 501c3 bonds is a project in Washington State This was a 1995 tax credit project that hit the market. And the financing strategy there was a soft loan from the city with ARPA funds, an interest-only program-related loan from the State Housing Finance Commission, 501c3 bonds also from that Housing Finance Commission, and then a sponsor loan. Of course, this 501c3 bonds can be paired with other OHCS resources, including our Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits. And then the last thing I'll note here is that the bond issuance process is pretty similar to the process that I'm sure most of you are familiar with for the private activity bonds associated with 4% LIHTC. There are some additional eligibility requirements that you'll be required to go through, and there won't be an award of volume cap. Next slide. Just a little bit about why OHCS is offering 501c3 bonds and why now. This is part of OHCS's focus to offer new lending tools. This is something that is mentioned in the OHCS statewide housing plan, which says to identify and implement innovations in financing for the preservation of affordable and low-cost market rate rental housing, and to provide a greater range of tools for affordable housing, pursuing opportunities to make the resources go further by recycling and increasing gap funding. As you all know, development resources are constrained, including the federally allocated volume cap for 4% LIHTC that I keep saying. So this is kind of one of our ways that we want to explore funding strategies outside of that PAB 4% LIHTC reliance. We have, of course, OHCS has bonding authority for sort of overall conduit bonds, but it's not a constraint in a way that it is for some of our other resources. As I mentioned on the last slide, this is a resource that may be used for development up to 120% AMI, which I think is the first or one of the first resources through OHCS that can go up to this limit. So that kind of expands the pool of what is eligible here. And we know that this is not the solution to affordable housing in Oregon. This is just another tool that we think and believe might be right for the right project. We've talked to other HFAs that offer 501c3 bonds, including Washington State. And so we've learned how they're useful in other states, and we want to bring that to OHCS. And then this last bullet about other projects down the line is a bit of a rabbit hole, but I just wanted to note that we understand that without additional credit enhancement, the interest rates that you get through 501c3 bonds might not always be a big difference. But OHCS as an agency is looking to restart direct lending. We haven't done this since 2005. We did this through elderly and disabled bonds and HUD risk share bonds. So I say all that to note, right now we will be offering 501c3 bonds through our standard conduit bond process, but down the line, there could be the opportunity for 501c3 bonds to be offered through direct lending, and that would come with additional credit enhancement. And I'll now pass it on to Oric for more about the eligibility.
Great. Thanks, Britt. Thanks, Kelso. Good to be here today and see lots of familiar names on the attendee list here. I'm Mike Schrader. I'm bond counsel with Oric, do a lot of work with OHCS on their housing programs on this. Want to note that I've got several of my other colleagues on, Doug Go, Chris Reynolds, Angie Gardner, Greg Blond, and Barbara League, who's our tax counsel. And I've got Barbara in the wings if there's hard tax questions after I go through the highlights here. But just wanting to just remind folks of the highlights around 501c3 bonds with the sort of beginning concept, as Kelso referred to there, alluded to affordability and the statutory authority for OHCS. So it's important to recall that we've got both statutory requirements in terms of the authority of OHCS under ORS 456 to issue bonds for eligible projects, eligible borrowers, affordability requirements, and so forth. And then we've got the federal tax code, which says what we can do to get the tax exemption, exempt interest on our debt for lower cost borrowing under 501c3 program on this. I'd also note that last spring, Oric gave a detailed, we spent I think an hour plus talking about 501c3 bonds, particularly in the context of volume cap restraints in Oregon. I believe Britt has included a link to that. So if you want to do a deep dive on that, that's there. And of course, you can always ask us questions on this. But just a reminder then that 501c3 bonds are a type of private activity bonds. So while 501c3 bonds are always private activity bonds, not all private activity bonds are 501c3 bonds. So private activity bond is a larger category of tax-exempt bonds on that. Eligible borrowers who can benefit from 501c3 bonds have to be nonprofits and 501c3 organizations. So again, not all nonprofits are 501c3s, but all 501c3s are nonprofits. So that's just important to note. And what's really critical in evaluating your ability to be a beneficiary of 501c3 is that the issuance of the bonds has to be in furtherance of the charitable or exempt purpose of the nonprofit entity. So while housing might be a good thing and be a charitable or exempt purpose, if that's not your exempt purpose as a 501c3, you probably can't issue 501c3 bonds. So we get questions regularly from various kinds of 501c3 organizations who are looking at workforce or middle or even affordable housing projects. And again, the key is the analysis around what is your exempt purpose and is the tax exempt borrowing in furtherance of your exempt purpose to your organization as opposed to just generally a good thing. Just note that an LLC itself is not going to be a 501c3, but if it's a single member LLC, you can sort of isolate that project liability in an LLC if you create a single member LLC with the 501c3 as the single member of that entity, or even multiple 501c3s as members of an LLC. So there's various ways that you can structure that. In terms of exempt purpose, certainly what we see most of the time is 501c nonprofits whose mission is housing, lessening the burdens of the poor and distress. So capital A, affordable housing with sort of standard income limits around the alternative tests of 20 at 50 or 40 at 60, plus 75 at 80. So a typical 501c3 capital A affordable housing project, you have those alternative tests, 20 at 50, 40 at 60, and 75 at 80, which also means you've got some flexibility for some higher income units, workforce units, or other units. So, but again, those federal tax requirements can differ from statutory and program requirements for OHCS. So when you're looking at rents and affordability limitations, it's important to look at both sets of constraints and constraints that might come with other resources that are coming into your project. Britt, if we can do the next slide, please. Great. There we go. So this is just about the organization itself. And again, our team here at ORIC, we see a lot of 501c3 conduit revenue bonds across a broad range of uses, from a capital A affordable housing to workforce or middle housing to senior housing to colleges and universities, healthcare. So there's a broad range of users or nonprofits that can benefit from 501c3 financing. So first of all, again, it must be organized and operated exclusively for the exempt purposes of Section 501c3. So again, this is what happens when you form a C3, you get an exemption letter. None of the earnings may inure to the benefit of a private shareholder or individual. Again, a nonprofit is a nonprofit and not sort of third-party for-profit beneficiaries. Constraints on legislation and political activities are again part of this as well, and then no inurement or private benefit as well on this for a 501c3. And again, this is all part of the tax due diligence process, which goes into determining eligibility under 501c3 for the approving tax opinion, which we would give in collaboration with the Borrowers Council on this project, which I would expect to be look very similar to what we do in the conduit program for private activity bond LIHTC projects, where there's an intake process, there's a review, there's a due diligence. I would expect these processes to be very, very similar and parallel to what you're all comfortable and see typically in the current conduit program for OHCS. So Britt, next slide. Okay, I think where we get probably the most questions around 501c3 bonds is around ownership. What does it mean to have tax ownership in the entity? And these rules are really very strict in terms of the 501c3 entity must own the project at all times the bonds are outstanding. Now, you can have, so what that means is that you could have the 501c3 bonds pay off and the tax requirements would be released at that point as a federal tax matter. However, if you've issued through OHCS, you probably have longer term covenants and more extensive requirements around affordability than just having those affordability covenants so long as the bonds are outstanding. But that's the federal tax rule versus the statutory or program requirements of OHCS as your bond issuer on this. There's a series of tests of private business use. There's private payment, private use, private payment, private security, and all of those are sort of separate tests, but all interrelated. Who's the user of the project? What's the source of payment? Who's providing the security? And generally, you're okay if that private involvement is less than 5% on that. So one thing to note on the ownership test is what that really means, among other things, is that in structuring your capital stack for a 501c3 bond, you can have debt, but you can only have debt. And your debt has to really be debt on this. So you can't, for example, if you've got subordinate debt, it's fine if it's cash flow debt or otherwise, but it can't be debt that is so soft that it turns into equity, which means then your debt holder would in fact be an equity holder and you wouldn't have whole ownership of the 501c3 by your party holding that soft debt. So again, all of the obligations need to be structured as debt and debt that's in fact true debt that is repayable on that. That's a regular question that we get. Now I would note, well, let me go down to the last piece here, and that is 501c3 bonds are subject to a number of the same tests and tax and other requirements as you have in a private activity 4% LIHTC deal. TEFRA, that is the public hearing and notice and approval requirements. The 95.5 good bad cost tests on that in terms of your capital costs and your soft costs and costs of issuance, including your 2% cost of issuance limit on that. I think it is anticipated that we're going to see a 501c3 program where the C3 bonds are going to be paired with other resources. So hopefully we have the same good result that we have in most of our deals currently, where you have multiple resources and some with greater flexibility than the bond proceeds. So you can allocate cost sources to uses in a way that gives you optimal flexibility on your capital stack to cover all of your project costs. We certainly there's certainly interest in terms of for-profit developers saying, well, can I just create my own 501c3 and have a captive C3 and have these sort of interrelated transactions? And the answer is maybe, but be really, really careful here because you're subject to qualified management contract and other rules on this. So this notion of a for-profit having a captive 501c3 is feasible, but you've got to navigate very carefully and deliberately tax rules on this so you don't, again, have these private use, private benefit, or ownership or deemed ownership outside of the 501c3 itself. The last item I would note is that what we refer to generally as the Donnelly Amendment limitations, which preclude using tax-exempt financing for the acquisition of an existing residential project without either significant rehab in the amount of the actual bond issuance or placing affordable rent restrictions on that project. So if you wanted to, for example, purchase an existing project and have it subject to income limits that were above the affordable limits, say 80 to 100% AMI because you're doing workforce, you can't do that under Donnelly if it's an existing building. If it's a new acquisition, that's fine. But if it's an existing project, you'd have to be at 20 at 50, 40 at 60, or 75 at 80. And again, we can always have those conversations about not navigating the Donnelly amendments in the context of an acquisition or rehab of an existing facility. So those are, I think, just kind of the high level items on tax compliance that I wanted to highlight today. Again, we can open up for questions later. And as noted, we've got our PowerPoint and presentation from last spring. That's, I think, a good resource as well. So Kelsey, let me turn it back to you.
Great. This will be the last slide before we open it up for questions. I just wanted to talk through what we anticipate the application process looking like. It will be through the ORCA, and we see two potential phases. The first one is a bit simpler. And with this phase, we really see sponsors mainly applying for 501c3 bonds when they're paired with other OHCS resources. And so this shouldn't change the ORCA process all that much. If you're going through and applying for LIFT, for example, it should be fairly straightforward to add on also applying for 501c3 bonds. There is the possibility to only apply for 501c3 bonds in this phase, but you would still have to go through sort of the full standard ORCA process. And this is just because any funding that we are attached to has to go through our funding standards, and the standard ORCA process is the one that our Housing Stability Council has approved. These will be ready fairly quickly, so in the next few months, probably early 2025, and we'll send out a TA, a technical advisory, when they're ready to go in the ORCA. We realize that if you are just applying for 501c3 bonds, then going through the ORCA might be too time intensive if you're just looking for a tax exempt bond from us. And so that's why we have on here a potential phase 2, where if there is demand from sponsors, we could consider shortening the ORCA process for 501c3 bond only applications. This will be a longer phase. It will need to go to the Housing Stability Council for discussion and approval, but it is a possibility if that's something that sponsors are needing. And I think that's it. I think we're to questions. Yeah.
Great. Well, I will stop sharing the slides so we can all see each other. I'm hoping if you've got a question, if you could either put it in the chat or raise your hand. There should be a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen in the menu ribbon. But yeah, please raise your hand. And then if you could share your affiliation, your name and affiliation before your question, that would be really helpful for our note takers. And we will be sharing the slides after the meeting, so fear not. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. And I don't see any hands raised. If you are desperately trying to ask a question either way, and it's not working, you should be able to send me a direct message at the ARH division. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. I'm glad it's working. Kathy, please go ahead.
Hi, Kathy Swift from Heritage Bank. Question. It is, it's not obvious from your presentation, but I know by its nature, so maybe some folks don't, that this is a bank debt that layers on the tax benefit from your due diligence process and financing agreement and the like. I think that might be helpful to some folks to know.
Hi, this is Barbara League at ORIC. So let me say that a different way. That's a great point. In order to get tax exempt interest, the issuer of the debt has to be OHCS. You can't go directly to a bank without OHCS involved and have the interest be tax exempt. It's the borrower's debt, the way it's structured through the documents. But for tax purposes, the issuer is treated as OHCS. And so I think that's a good distinction to make.
But just to also, this is Doug Go at ORIC, just to clarify, while banks can participate in this, you could also do an underwriting that would be where you'd have a Citigroup or a non-bank underwriter underwrite the 501c3 bonds. It doesn't require to, you don't have to do it through a bank.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Kathy, for the question. We're going to go to the chat for our next one, unless there are, I'm reading your face, Oric, folks. I'm trying to read your faces to see if there's anything you want to add to that, but I'll keep moving. But don't be afraid to keep chiming in. Okay, we have a question from Jeremy from PCRI. Can this be used as a standalone scattered site, for redevelopment?
A
Yep.
stand. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Barbara. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, a standalone scattered site, I'm not, it can be used for standalone projects. It can also be used for scattered site projects. You can do redevelopment, but as Mike mentioned, if you are acquiring an existing development, you either have to comply with the income limits, or you have to do significant, basically 100% rehab. You have to spend as much as you spend on acquiring the property on rehab. So typically we don't see anyone choose that option. Instead, we see them choose the income requirements, which are either 20 at 50 or 40 at 60 plus. Typically, we're going to see 75 at 80, depending on your charitable purpose.
Yeah, and I can add to that, Barbara. Jeremy, having some familiar with the PCRI portfolio of single family homes, I suspect that if you were going to refinance your portfolio, you could do that with a 501c3 bond. And I think I recall there's been some discussions about doing that previously. So the answer is the high level answer is yes, you could finance or refinance the PCRI portfolio and any redevelopment within that portfolio as a 501c3. But in doing so, if you were to take, say, a duplex or a fourplex and build more density on one of those lots, you would also be, if you were to do that on a 501c3 basis, you'd have to keep the ownership of that particular redevelopment within the larger financed collective projects in the same 501c3 ownership. And I think where it can be challenging, and Jeremy, we'd be happy to have a sidebar with you and your team on this as well, is if you're trying to finance the portfolio on a 501c3 basis and then do redevelopment with a different plan of finance that didn't involve a 501c3 ownership structure on that. So the answer is yes, in terms of owning the portfolio and financing the portfolio as a 501c3. And the answer is maybe, depending on how you want to roll pieces of that redevelopment within the portfolio, assuming that's the objective, using a 501c3 structure. So I hope that's responsive, Jeremy.
And Jeremy, please feel free to chime in if you want a follow-up question. We don't have currently any additional questions in the chat or hands raised, so you're free to, if you'd like to say anything else, or get any additional clarifying information. Okay, Christopher, we will, Jeremy, we'll come back if you've got anything you want to add there. Christopher, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm Christopher Eibling. I'm an associate housing developer with Community Partners for Affordable Housing. Mike, you had mentioned it was going to be an ownership question. So basically like a single entity LLC where the nonprofit is part of that LLC is eligible. What about post year 15 limited partnerships where the limited partnership is intact, but the nonprofit is both general and limited partner, let's say? Would that be eligible for this type of bond issuance?
I believe so, Christopher. I'm going to defer to Barbara to add more detail there, but I believe if all of the ownership is the partnership interests are all in the C3, then you can disregard the entity and you get the C3 status of the ownership entity in that. So yeah, definitely a year 15 structure that you could consider in terms of resyndication. Barbara, do you want to add to that?
No, that's right. We have done those transactions, and they are definitely doable.
Nice, good to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Okay, we've got a question from Lisa from CASA in the chat here about the income limitations. The specific limitations I think she heard are in the chat. Mike, Barbara, if y'all want to take a look and check to see if that's correct.
Yeah, no, Lisa, that's a great question. So let me clarify, and then Barbara can kick me under the table and add more to this detail. We sort of start with the assumption that the exempt purpose or charitable purpose of the 501c3 borrower is housing or affordable housing more specifically. And if that's the exempt or charitable purpose, then you've got these alternative tests, 20% of the units at 50% AMI and below, or as you state, 40% of units at 60% AMI below, plus 75% of units at 80% AMI and below. So that's the test for affordable for nonprofits whose exempt purpose is doing affordable housing. However, you can also have 501c3 bonds issued in furtherance of other exempt purposes. For example, we are doing several projects and have done projects where the exempt purpose is, quote, lessening the burdens of government. And what that is a special purpose 501c3 who holds hands with the local jurisdiction, be it a housing authority, city, or other entity, and forms a special purpose nonprofit entity to do workforce or middle or other housing outside of affordable housing. And again, that's all okay as long as you get that approved, and that's the recognized exempt purpose by the IRS. That is another way that you can do 501c3 bonds, and not under a traditional affordable exempt purpose model. We've also seen, and there's significant interest, and we've seen it done where a healthcare institution or an educational institution will need to build housing that's a lowercase a affordable for technicians, teachers, nurses, and others, think essential workers, in furtherance of their respective educational missions or health provision of health services or otherwise. So there's multiple ways in terms of there's multiple exempt purposes pursuant to which housing and 501c3 bonds can be issued. Barbara, do you want to add to that?
No, Mike, I think you covered it. Just, to sum, you have the requirements of your charitable purpose, then you have some general tax requirements called the Donnelly amendments that go on top, and then you have the OHCS requirements. So there's 3 sets of requirements, and amongst the 3, that will determine your AMI limitations.
Great. And just remember, group, as we said earlier, though, then those are just the tax rules. You have to layer those tax rules on the statutory, programmatic, and other requirements of OHCS if you're looking to make this all work under an OHCS as your issuer, and particularly, as we suspect will be the case, the need for supplemental resources or leveraging other resources from OHCS. You'll be subject not only to the tax rules, but the requirements and restrictions that go with those funds, and having OHCS as your funding partner.
Thank you for that question, Lisa. We are doing great on time, so keep those questions coming. Great. Jeremy has a follow-up. Are the limits to the value of the bonds that we can use on one project? Sorry, I'm probably reading that incorrectly, Jeremy, if you want to come off mute and say more there.
Sure. Are you setting up a limit as to, like, this one project can only get up to $5 million worth of bonds, or one project can get 10 million worth of bonds, or 2 million, or is there a limit that's being contemplated?
So I believe that there's a federal requirement. Is the federal requirement 150 million? Is that the maximum, Mike, and then once I know that, I can explain OHCS, but I'm just curious.
Barbara, do you want to talk about the 150 million rule?
Sure. So there are federal tax limitations on the amount of your bond. $150 million is typically not going to be your limit for these types of bonds, if 95% of your proceeds go to capital expenditures. So I would say very softly on the tax side, as a practical matter, it's usually pretty easy to structure around any upper end limitations. Instead, that upper end limitation is going to be driven by the capital needs of your project. On the tax side.
Yeah, thank you. At this moment, we don't have a maximum for OHCS. I think it'll just depend on what we're seeing come through the pipeline. I don't know. We have Hattie here who works more with these bond issuances. If Hattie, curious if you have thoughts on that.
Hey, Kelso, sorry. Charlie decided to talk right as I decided to come off of mute here. So sorry about the dog in the background. Yeah, we do not currently have any maximum end on the 501c3 side of things. So I think we'll need to see, what the appetite is you know, what these are going to look like. We'll defer to our partners here with ORIC, who have done projects in other states with other development teams, to let us know kind of what that looks like. So just excited to have potentially another opportunity to get some more deals in the pipeline and get some construction going.
Patty, as if anybody doesn't know who you are, would you mind just letting folks know your role here at OHCS? I'm sure they know, but just in case.
Sure, thanks, Britt, no problem. So Hattie Ayat, I'm the housing production manager in the affordable rental housing group.
Thank you. Okay, so I do not see any other questions in the chat nor hands. Okay, there we go. Christopher, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. I guess I have two questions and they're pretty similar. So eligible expenses, when we're talking good cost, bad costs, are we, like for 501c3, these costs should be similar, I assume, to typical LIHTC PAB?
Correct.
As a general
Barbara?
matter, yes. Yeah. As a general matter, yeah.
Okay, great. And then I assume it's a similar answer for this, but when we're looking at, you know, Mike, you had referenced that there's statutory requirements from OHCS for C3 issuance. Would the, and maybe we're not this far along yet, but would the regulatory documents be identical to those of private activity bond or conduit bond issuance on LIHTC deals?
Christopher, I think, again, we're going to defer to program requirements, if you would, from Kelso and Hattie and the team there in terms of what those would be. Again, sort of balancing the federal tax requirements, that you're going to see one thing in the bond or tax regulatory agreement. You may see something slightly different in the department operating agreement in terms of constraints. But I think I think there's a lot more flexibility, if you would, in terms of income limits, project configurations, moving to the middle, if you would, if you're looking at a 501c3 issuance versus a standard resource constrained volume cap private activity bond with a 4% deal on that. And you know, maybe a follow-up on that is to have maybe Kelso and Hattie talk about the ORCA process and how they view a C3 option as creating greater flexibility in that ORCA process in terms of pairing resources. Now that I didn't want to cut off your question, Christopher, if I responded.
That's it. Thank you. Appreciate
Okay.
it.
Thanks, Christopher. Great question. Okay, I'm going to do that awkward thing. I'm going to wait and not say anything for 7 seconds so folks can get their thoughts together and we can continue with questions. And I would just want to say too, this is not your last, you know, of course, this is not your last chance to ask questions. We'll share the recording and the slides. And we've got some contact information for you for follow-up questions as well once we move to wrap up. But before we do that, I will be quiet for 7 seconds and wait for more questions. Okay, I cannot stand it any longer. If everyone, if we're okay for now, I think we can move to wrap up and kind of talking about potential next steps. And again, if you have any questions, let us know. But let me.
There's one more in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have an expected date to roll this out? So the phase 1, which is kind of just going through the standard workup process, that should be ready to go fairly soon. So I would say early 2025, something like January or February. So fairly soon on that.
Thanks, Kelso. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share this. I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat the fact sheet again. Kelso did send this out with the invite, but there have been a couple of updates. But again, it is still draft, so it's not the final version. So I will make sure to put that in the chat. This is the contact information if you've got follow-up questions. Of course, if you have 501c3 specific questions that are not related to OHCS as the issuer, it sounds like ORIC may be open to answering those questions. So that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here in force. That's great. Okay, Stop sharing that. Here we go. Check your less than sign in the presentation. Okay, we will check that. Thanks. Oh, we've got a question from Bill. What are the typical issuing costs?
So the issuing costs will look very similar to what sponsors are used to through the private activity bond conduit bond issuance process. We are looking at updating those right now. So more to come there. There's going to be a public comment process around that, as well as Housing Stability Council discussions as well. So we are looking to update those, but it'll be the same for private activity bond issuance costs, and then 501c3 as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. You had excellent questions. Again, we're here for any additional questions that come up. We're really excited about what this resource could potentially do in an environment where we may see a gradual decline in resources that we receive. So we really welcome your feedback and how we can make this the most useful resource possible. Again, we will send out the recording and the slides shortly, and the draft fact sheet is in the chat. And if you need anything else, let us know, and please watch this space. Stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks all.